Nate never doubted Alice until he noticed the first alarming signs. Late-night calls she ignored. Meetings he knew nothing about. One day, coming home early, he saw her nervously hide her phone. What was she trying to conceal? When an anonymous message pointed to her secret evenings at a cafe with another man, Nate decided to uncover the truth. What he saw made his heart stop. But was it just an innocent friendship or the beginning of something more? Each new detail brought him closer to a revelation that could change everything. What was hiding behind her smile? Was he ready to find out who his wife really was? I caught her cheating. Wait until you see what I did next. The sun filled the cozy living room, reflecting off the antique mirror hanging above the fireplace. Nate stood in the doorway, looking at his wife, Alice. Are you sure you don't want to come with us? She asked, adjusting the golden bracelet on her wrist. Her eyes radiated the same warmth Nate had always loved, but today he saw something different in them. A chill. No, Nate replied shortly, holding a newspaper. Work won't wait. Alice shrugged and turned toward the door. Her scent lingered in the air as she quickly disappeared through the threshold. Nate glanced at his watch. Time will set everything straight, he thought, not knowing how soon those words would become reality. A few hours later, when Alice was supposed to be at a meeting with her friends, Nate's phone vibrated. A message. Anonymous. She's at the cafe on Fifth Avenue right now. Not alone. Nate's hand trembled. He reread the message. His heart began to race. He tried to convince himself it was someone's joke, but the growing anxiety swelled like a snowball. All right, let's see for ourselves, he said to himself, grabbing his car keys. The cafe was crowded, but Nate spotted her immediately. She sat in a corner with a man in an expensive suit. Their heads were close together as if sharing secrets. Nate felt his blood rush to his face. He wanted to barge in and cause a scene, but something held him back. Logic urged him to wait, to gather more evidence. He pulled out his phone and took several pictures, his hands trembling with tension. Damn it, Alice, what are you doing? He whispered, heading back to his car. At home, Nate reviewed the photos, searching for an explanation. Perhaps it was just a business meeting? Perhaps he had imagined it all? But deep down, he knew the truth. That evening, when Alice returned, she acted as if nothing had happened. She hugged him, kissed his cheek, and began talking about how much fun she had with her friends. Nate listened, but his eyes scrutinized her face, searching for any hint of a lie. Late at night, after the lights in the house were out and Alice was already asleep, Nate sat in his office. On the desk lay the printed photos he had taken at the cafe. Alice's face in each shot was filled with a tenderness he hadn't seen in their relationship for a long time. But this time, it was directed at another man. His fists clenched. If this is true, Nate whispered, I'll find out. At dawn, he dialed a number he had found online. Detective James Richardson was known for his meticulousness and ability to uncover truths even where they were carefully hidden. Are you sure you want to know the truth? James asked when they met in a small downtown office. Nate hesitated for only a moment. Yes, I need to know everything. All right, but I warn you, the truth isn't always what you want to hear. Over the next week, James updated Nate on his every step. He followed Alice, recorded her conversations, and took photos. Each update made Nate feel more betrayed as he repeatedly saw her in the company of the same man. But one night, everything changed. James called him at 2 a.m. We need to meet. There's something you have to see. In a dark alley behind a coffee shop, Nate received a flash drive containing a video. A video that would forever change his perception of Alice. Sitting in his car under the streetlight, he connected it to his laptop. The camera captured Alice leaving a hotel with the same man. Their movements were filled with a familiar intimacy. But what struck Nate the most was the moment she turned to the camera and smiled coldly, as if she knew he would see this. Nate felt his world crumbling. At home, he waited for Alice, leaving the door unlocked. She came back late, her perfume leaving a faint trace in the air. How was your day? He asked, looking her in the eye. Alice stopped, surprised by his tone. Not bad. And yours? Great. You know, I found something interesting. Nate pulled out his phone and showed her the video. Alice's face froze, but she wasn't scared. Instead, Her eyes sparkled with defiance. You wanted to know the truth? Now you know. But are you ready for everything that comes with it? Her words were like a knife to the heart. Nate didn't know how to respond. Alice walked past him, went upstairs, and shut the bedroom door. James Richardson had always prided himself on his ability to remain objective. But this time, it was different. The files he received were too troubling to simply pass on to his client. He hesitated for a moment before dialing Nate's number. You need to see this in person, James said, his voice serious, even slightly tense. An hour later, Nate was in the detective's small office. On the table lay a stack of papers, photographs, and a flash drive. James silently inserted it into a laptop and pressed play. The screen filled with black and white footage showing Alice. She stood in a hotel room holding a large black case. The same man Nate had seen at the café handed her documents, which she carefully examined. What does this mean? Nate asked, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. James paused the video and showed him photographs. They depicted the same documents in close-up. But one detail caught Nate's eye, a logo of a major pharmaceutical company he had worked with before. It was classified information. This can't be, Nate whispered, feeling his knees weaken. I've checked, James said. Your wife isn't just cheating on you. She's selling confidential information to competitors. And that man is just one of her contacts. Nate leaned back in his chair, trying to process how this was possible. Alice had always seemed so loyal and honest. But now he saw her in a completely different light. And that's not all, James continued. There's another thing you need to know. The detective handed Nate another file. It was a copy of Alice's financial records. Large sums of money were being transferred to offshore accounts monthly. It turned out her double life wasn't just personal. It was also financial. What should I do? Nate asked, his voice trembling with emotion. That's up to you. You can go to the police. Or you can try to handle it yourself, James replied. When Nate returned home that night, he couldn't look at Alice the same way. She was sitting in their living room, smiling at him as if nothing had happened. But he already knew the truth. And now he had to decide what to do next. In the morning, as the sun began to peek through the blinds, Nate sat in the kitchen, staring into a cup of cold coffee. His head throbbed from a sleepless night, and his thoughts raced like trapped animals. He had made a decision. No confrontations, no scandals. He would leave everything as it was until he figured out what to do next. But the calm he sought was an illusion. A phone call interrupted his thoughts. The screen displayed a name, Lawrence, his boss. Nate answered, trying to suppress his unease. Nate, we need to talk. Lawrence's voice was dry, devoid of warmth. Can you come to the office? Within an hour, Nate was sitting in Lawrence's office. On the desk lay a folder of documents, and with each page Lawrence turned, Nate's anxiety grew. We've discovered a data breach, Lawrence finally said. And unfortunately, it involves you. What do you mean? Nate's voice was dry, but his heart pounded in panic. Lawrence opened the file and showed him several reports. They bore his signature and emails. But Nate knew he had never sent those documents. Someone had forged his name. This has to be a mistake, he said, trying to remain calm. I had nothing to do with this. Nate, Lawrence looked at him with a heavy gaze. We'll investigate everything, but if it's true, the consequences will be severe. At home, Nate wandered through the rooms in confusion. He couldn't understand how this had happened, but one thought wouldn't leave his mind. Alice. He began checking their shared computer, going through emails, trying to find a lead. And he found one. Emails she had sent from his account, documents she had uploaded at night when she thought he was asleep. She wasn't just betraying him as a wife. She was destroying him as a professional. When she returned home, he was already waiting for her. On the living room table lay all the evidence. Do you want to explain something? He asked as she walked in. Alice stopped. Her expression changed. She realized she had been caught. But instead of defending herself, she smiled. It's your own fault, Nate. You were so busy with your work that you didn't even notice how our life turned into an illusion. That doesn't justify what you did, he shouted, holding up the documents. You've destroyed everything I worked for. Did you ever think about why I did it? Her voice was quiet but cold. You lost us, Nate. I just took what's mine." Her words were like poison. Nate stood there, unable to believe that the woman he loved could betray him so easily. That night, he sat in his car parked outside their house. He couldn't stay in the same space with her. But he also knew this wasn't over. Alice was dangerous, and now he had to be ready for anything. The night was quiet, but Nate couldn't sleep. His thoughts were tangled, like a ball of snakes. Next to him lay a woman he no longer recognized. Alice acted as if nothing had happened, but there was a cold calculation in her gaze that frightened him more than anything. Early in the morning, Nate received an unexpected call from his banker. His accounts had been frozen due to suspicion of fraud. Confused, he tried to figure out what had happened, but all the trails led back to signatures and documents that supposedly belonged to him. This time he understood. Alice had launched her attack. Returning home, he walked into the living room and saw her at the kitchen table. She was calmly drinking coffee, scrolling through her phone. "Do you have something to tell me?" Nate asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Alice looked up, her eyes glinting. "Why do you think that?" Her voice was sweet, but there was steel in it. "My accounts are frozen. Do you know what that means?" She put down her cup and stood, approaching him. Her smile was almost triumphant. "It means you're starting to understand who you're dealing with." Nate felt anger boiling inside him. He wanted to yell, but instead, he only whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Alice stopped a step away from him, her gaze icy. "Because I can, Nate. Because you thought you controlled everything, but you don't. This is my life, and now you're just a piece in my game." He couldn't hold back. He grabbed her arm, forcing her to look him in the eye. "If you think I'm just going to step aside, you're wrong." She pulled her arm free and smirked. "Then prove it." That evening, Nate decided to act. He began sifting through old documents, messages, photos, anything that could help him understand how far her schemes had gone. And what he found was worse than he could have imagined. Alice had used his name to create shell companies, launder money, and transfer confidential data. But the most terrifying thing was the list of contacts in her files, people ready to do anything to destroy Nate if necessary. He made copies of all the files he found and met with James. The detective was shocked by the scale of her operations. "This isn't just betrayal, Nate," James said. "This is a criminal empire, and she's willing to do anything to protect it." Returning home, Nate found Alice in their bedroom. She was standing by the window, looking out at the night city. He walked in and locked the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. She turned, her face impassive. "About what?" "How you're trying to destroy everything I've built." "No," he replied, stepping closer. "About how far you're willing to go. Because if you think I'll let you continue, you're wrong." Alice laughed, but there was no joy in her laughter. "Oh, Nate, don't you see? You're in my game now, and I won't let you ruin what I've worked for my whole life." When Nate woke up, the day seemed ordinary. But beneath its normalcy, something sinister lurked. Alice was already gone, and that gave him a moment to relax. But the unease didn't leave him. Her final words from the night before still echoed in his mind. "You don't know what I'm capable of, Nate, and you won't be able to stop it." The phone rang just as he was about to have his coffee. The number was unfamiliar. "Mr. Grayson? This is Officer Miller. We need you to come to the station for questioning." "Questioning? What's going on?" Nate felt his face flush. "There are serious allegations involving you. It would be best if you came voluntarily." Nate silently hung up. Cold sweat broke out on his back. Allegations? About what? He looked at the papers scattered on the table. All his attempts to gather evidence against Alice had been futile, but now it was clear. She had beaten him to it. The police station greeted him with cold silence. In a small, windowless room, 2 detectives were already waiting for him. "Do you know this man?" one of them asked, showing a photograph. It was the same man he had seen with Alice at the café. "But what did he have to do with this?" "I've only seen him once," Nate replied. "Interesting," said the other detective, "because according to these documents, you transferred him a substantial amount of money a few weeks ago." Nate was stunned. They showed him bank statements with his signature, but he knew he had never done such a thing. His voice trembled. "This is a forgery. I don't know how it happened, But it wasn't me. You also gave him access to your company's confidential data, the detective continued, tossing another document onto the table. Is this your email? Nate looked closely. The email address was his, but he hadn't written that message. It contained all the details that could destroy him. I didn't write this, he said, struggling to breathe. This is a setup. You know, it's very convenient to say that, the detective said with a sarcastic smirk. But we have evidence. And right now, you're the main suspect. After hours of questioning, Nate was released, but with a warning that the investigation was ongoing. He returned home feeling shattered. But when he walked into the house, a new shock awaited him. On the kitchen table lay a note from Alice. I hope you understand I'm serious. Next time, it'll be something bigger. Her signature perfectly sealed the message, like the final twist of a knife. Nate realized she was willing to destroy him, even if it meant going to extremes. That night, he called James again. She's playing with me, Nate said, gripping the phone. But I won't let her win. We still have a chance, James replied. But you'll have to take a risk. Darkness enveloped the streets as Nate sat silently in his car parked in a secluded corner. He was afraid to go home. After today's interrogation at the police station, his world was falling apart. And now he had only one option, run. The phone in his pocket vibrated. It was James. Nate, his voice was low and tense. I have bad news. The police have a warrant for your arrest. What? Nate's heart pounded like a drum. For what? They found new evidence. They believe you orchestrated the data breach and were involved in financial fraud. And worst of all, the documents they have look very convincing. Nate exhaled heavily. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. He felt the ground disappearing beneath him. What do I do? He asked. You need to disappear. At least for a while, until I can figure out a way to expose their lies. If they find you, it's over. After hanging up, Nate sat in silence for several minutes. Everything he had built over the years now lay in ruins. But he had no choice. He knew he had to fight, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Hours later, Nate was speeding down an empty highway outside the city. He had left his phone in a trash bin at a gas station and switched to a rental car under a fake name. Every second of freedom was precious. But even in this chaos, the thought of Alice wouldn't leave his mind. She set all this up, he whispered to himself. But why? What is she trying to achieve? The next step of his plan was clear. He knew a place where he might find answers. His old friend Marcus, who once worked in cybersecurity, could help him untangle this web of lies. If anyone could help him, it was Marcus. Marcus lived in a small house on the outskirts of a quiet town. When Nate knocked on the door, a gruff voice responded. Who's there? It's me, Nate. I need your help. The door opened, and Marcus eyed him suspiciously. You look awful. What happened? Nate briefly recounted the events of the past few days. Marcus listened without interrupting, but his expression grew increasingly serious. This is bad, he said when Nate finished. If what you're saying is true, she set you up expertly. But I can try to help. Marcus sat down at his computer and began examining the data Nate had brought with him. Gradually, the picture began to take shape. Alice hadn't just forged documents. She had used an intricate scheme to do it. But the most shocking revelation was that she was working with people Nate had considered friends. Did you see this? Marcus asked, pointing at the screen. One of the signatures belongs to Harry, your colleague. Nate felt anger boiling inside him. Harry was someone he trusted more than anyone else. But now, everything had changed. I need more information, Nate said. Something to confirm this. Marcus nodded. I'll do it. But you need to be careful. If they find out you're here, it could end badly. As Marcus worked, Nate couldn't sit still. He stepped outside to clear his head. But his thoughts were interrupted by headlights from a car that stopped nearby. Two men in suits stepped out. They're here, Nate whispered, hurrying back into the house. Marcus, we have a problem. Damn, Marcus replied. You need to go. I'll finish the work and contact you. But for now, run. Nate slipped out through the back door, avoiding the headlights. He knew he was now a target. If he couldn't find a way to prove his innocence, it would be the end. Marcus remained at his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was deep into his work, analyzing the files he had gathered for Nate. Each new document revealed shocking details, but one name among the records caught his attention. "Nate, you need to see this," Marcus said, swiveling his chair around. His voice was serious, almost anxious. Nate came closer and leaned over the screen. "What is it?" Marcus pointed to one of the files. "This is her list of contacts. But this one, it's the most interesting. Recognize the name?" Nate's gaze froze on the highlighted line. His heart sank. It was Senator Richard Gaines, one of the most influential politicians in the country, a man with an impeccable reputation, respected by all. "Gaines?" Nate whispered, unable to believe his eyes. "How is he connected to Alice?" Marcus nodded. "They've been working together for years. He helps her cover her tracks. She's not just cunning, Nate. She has support at the highest level." Nate felt his world collapsing again. If this were true, his chances of proving his innocence were even slimmer. The thought that the senator might intervene to destroy him haunted him. "We need evidence," he finally said. "Something that directly links them." Marcus nodded and turned back to his computer. Over the next several hours, they worked without pause, poring over emails, financial reports, and hidden records. But the most shocking discovery was a video they uncovered. In the footage, Alice sat at a desk in a luxurious office. Across from her was Richard Gaines. They were discussing some kind of deal, and then the senator handed her a folder. "This can't be," Nate whispered as he watched the video. "He's risking everything to help her?" Marcus paused the video and looked at Nate. "This means we have something on him, but it's not enough. If we try to expose this without additional proof, they'll crush us. So what do we do?" Nate asked, his voice filled with despair. "We'll find more," Marcus replied. "But it'll take time, and you need to be careful. If they find out we're digging into them, it could end badly." A few days later, Nate received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was calm but cold. "Nate, you're playing with fire. You'd better stop before it's too late." "Who is this?" he asked, but the line went dead. He knew it was a warning, and he knew Alice was behind it, but it only fueled his determination. He couldn't let her win. Returning to Marcus, Nate decided to take a risk. They began working on contacting a journalist who could help expose the material. But even that came with its challenges. The journalist they chose was known for his integrity, but also for his fearlessness in exposing powerful figures. "If we do this right," Nate said, "we can destroy their game." "And if we don't?" Marcus asked. Nate hesitated, but his response was firm. "We don't have another choice." That evening, just as they finished preparing the materials, Marcus's door was kicked open. Two men burst into the room, men Nate recognized. They were the same ones who had been following him earlier. "The game's over, Nate," one of them said, pointing a gun at him. Nate knew this wasn't the end, but now he was in a situation where every wrong move could be his last. The night was tense, and Nate felt its weight with every breath. He sat in a dimly lit room, the weak light of a desk lamp illuminating his tired face. On the table before him lay documents and a flash drive, everything he had managed to gather against Alice. But now he realized it wasn't enough. She had a protector, someone powerful and ruthless. He needed a plan, but he didn't know what to do next. A knock at the door broke the silence. Nate jumped up, his heart pounding. He slowly approached the door and peered through the peephole. Standing on the doorstep was Alice. Her figure was like a ghost from his past. She was dressed in a black coat, her familiar yet now loathsome smile on her face. Nate opened the door, not hiding his anger. "What do you want?" His voice was cold. "We need to talk," she replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Nate shut the door and watched as she walked into the living room. Her movements were confident, almost brazen. "You have 1 minute," he said, standing in the doorway. Alice sat on the couch, crossing her legs as if she owned the place. "You're too emotional, Nate. That won't help you. You've destroyed my life, and now you're here to lecture me?" His voice rose. "I'm not in the mood for your games." Alice only smiled. "If you want to win, you need to listen. I have a proposal." Nate leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What else do you want? Money? My freedom? Or maybe my life?" "It's much simpler," she replied. You stop your investigation. Forget about the documents, the senator, and me. In return, I'll let you start a new life." Nate laughed, but there was bitterness in his voice. "You really think I'd believe you? After everything you've done?" Alice stood up and approached him. Her gaze was steady, almost icy. "This is your only chance. If you keep going, you'll destroy yourself. Do you think the senator will let you survive? You have no idea what he's capable of." "And you?" Nate interrupted. "What do you get out of this deal?" Alice paused for a moment before answering. "Freedom. Do you think I want to be his puppet? I don't have a choice, Nate. But if you stop, he'll let me disappear. And we can both move on with our lives." Nate felt his anger mix with pity. Her words sounded convincing, but he knew he couldn't trust her. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Alice leaned closer, her voice dropping to a quiet but threatening tone. "Then you'll lose. And not just you. Everyone you love will suffer too." Those words hit like a punch. Nate knew she was telling the truth. She was capable of anything, and now he found himself teetering on the edge of a precipice. "The choice is yours," she said, turning toward the door. "But you don't have much time." When the door closed behind her, Nate was left alone in the dimly lit room. His mind swung between rage and fear. He knew he couldn't give up, but he also understood that every move he made now would be under scrutiny. Nate sat in the empty room, the old clock on the wall ticking away the time. His thoughts were interrupted by heavy footsteps outside the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, but he felt that this encounter was inevitable. The door opened, and Alice walked in. This time, she looked different. Her tired eyes and worn face suggested she had endured something so dreadful it had changed her. Yet even in this state, she exuded her signature air of enigmatic confidence. "Here to destroy me again?" Nate leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. Alice simply sighed and sat across from him. "No, Nate. This time I'm here to tell you the truth." He smirked derisively. "The truth? From you? That's rich." "I know you don't believe me," she said, leaning forward, "but what I'm about to say will change everything." Nate remained silent, but his eyes were filled with tension. Alice studied him as if gauging how far she could push. "Senator Gaines," she began. "He's not just my patron. He was your enemy long before I came into your life." "What are you trying to say?" His voice was quiet, but it carried an undertone of menace. "You think I ruined your career?" Her eyes gleamed. "It was him. Gaines wanted to get rid of you for years. You got in his way when you uncovered that financial fraud case." Nate froze. Memories of the past came flooding back like waves. When his company was falsely accused of fraud, he had thought it was just a coincidence. But now everything seemed different. "You think I was just his puppet?" Alice continued. "Yes, I worked for him, but not by choice. He has something on me, and I had no choice but to follow his orders." "What does he have?" Nate asked, his voice almost a whisper. Alice lowered her eyes, appearing to wrestle with her thoughts. "It's about my past. Something I never told you. If I tell you now, you'll understand why I did what I did." Nate waited in silence, watching her struggle to find the words. "Richard Gaines isn't just a politician," she finally said. "He controls an entire network of corruption and crime. And I was a part of it long before I met you. When I tried to get out, he found a way to pull me back in. And you decided to use me as cover?" Nate's voice was filled with anger and pain. "I had no choice," she exclaimed. "I knew it would destroy you. But if I refused, he would destroy me." Silence fell between them. Nate felt his world shatter even more. He had always thought Alice was the root of all his problems, but now he realized she was just the tip of the iceberg. "What do you want now?" he asked. "I want to help you," she replied. "Together, we can stop him. But you have to trust me." Nate laughed bitterly, the laugh of a man who didn't know whom to trust anymore. "Trust you? After everything you've done?" "If you don't, you'll lose everything," Alice said. "Gaines won't stop. He's already planning how to eliminate you. And if we don't stop him, he'll win." Nate stared at her, searching for any spark of truth in her words. But even if she was telling the truth, could he risk trusting her again? Nate sat in the dark room, trying to gather his thoughts. The conversation with Alice had left only chaos and doubt. Her words about Gaines still echoed in his mind, but he knew he couldn't accept them blindly. Alice was a master manipulator, and every move she made could have a hidden agenda. A knock at the door shattered the silence like a gunshot. Nate approached cautiously, holding his breath. On the doorstep stood Alice again. Her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with anxiety. "We're not done," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What now?" Nate asked coldly. "You want to destroy me even more?" Alice stopped in the middle of the room and looked him straight in the eye. "I have something that will make you listen." Nate crossed his arms, trying to hide his unease. "You've got 2 minutes." Alice pulled an old notebook from her bag and tossed it onto the table. "This is Gaines's journal. Everything is in here. His deals, his crimes, the names of those who helped him. And your name is in it too." Nate flinched. He opened the notebook and began flipping through the pages. Each line was like a punch. His name really was listed. Gaines had used him to cover up his own schemes. This can't be," he whispered. "It's true," Alice said. "Gaines set you up long before I came into your life. I was just a tool in his game." Nate dropped the notebook on the table, trying to process how to proceed. He knew these records could destroy Gaines, but they could also destroy him. "Why are you bringing this to me?" he asked, searching for any hint of truth in her words. Alice stepped closer. "Because I don't want to be his puppet anymore. I know this won't redeem me in your eyes, but it might save you. And you expect me to trust you? After everything?" His voice trembled with anger. Alice didn't look away. "You don't have a choice." Suddenly, something heavy struck the room's window. Nate rushed to it and saw a car speeding away. "We have to go," Alice said, grabbing his arm. "If they know we have the journal, it's dangerous." "Who are they?" Nate shouted. "Gaines's people," she replied. "They won't stop until they destroy everything." Nate and Alice ran out of the house through the back door. They got into a car and sped away. On the road, Alice handed him a phone. "There's a journalist's number here. He's the only one we can trust. We need to get the journal to him." Nate looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I want to end this. And if it means destroying myself, I'm ready." Her words were unexpected. Nate felt a growing conflict inside. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he had no choice left. They were heading into the unknown, knowing every step could be their last. The car sped down a deserted road when Nate noticed 2 vehicles quickly catching up in the rearview mirror. His heart raced, and his hands gripped the wheel tighter. "Someone's following us," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. Alice, sitting beside him, turned to look back. Her face remained calm, but her gaze scanned the road intently. "We need to act now," she said. "Act how? Do you have a plan?" Nate glanced at her briefly. Alice opened her bag and pulled out a pocket flashlight. "Turn off the road. We'll find a place to hide." Nate hesitated, but her calm and confidence convinced him. He sharply turned the wheel and veered onto a narrow dirt road. Within minutes, they were deep in a forest, where they had to stop the car. "Let's hide," Alice whispered. "They won't find us if we're careful." They quickly got out of the car and headed into the woods. The sounds of engines grew louder, but then faded. Nate and Alice stopped among the trees, listening intently. "They've stopped," Nate whispered. "Maybe they're searching for us on foot," Alice replied. "We should split up." "That's a bad idea," he objected. "We have a better chance together." "They're after me," she said firmly. "You have the journal. You need to get it to safety." Nate hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Fine. Just don't do anything reckless." Alice smiled, but her gaze remained serious. "Good luck, Nate." They parted ways. Nate moved cautiously, trying to avoid making noise. A few minutes later, he reached the road and saw an old house where he was supposed to meet the journalist. Entering the building, he found a man waiting for him at a table. "Did you bring it?" the journalist asked. Nate took out the journal and placed it on the table. "It's all here. If you publish this, they won't be able to hide their crimes anymore." The journalist flipped through a few pages and looked up at Nate. "Are you sure you're ready for the consequences?" "I don't have a choice," Nate replied. "Just do it." Meanwhile, Alice moved through the forest, trying to evade her pursuers. Her breathing was heavy, but she didn't stop. Eventually, she found an old shed and hid inside. Listening to the sounds outside, she prepared for a possible confrontation. The footsteps grew closer. Alice pressed herself against the wall, clutching a heavy wooden plank she had found on the floor. She knew she had to be ready for anything. Darkness enveloped everything as Nate stopped on the road. His heart pounded, and his thoughts raced. He had handed the journal to the journalist, but now the thought of Alice being in danger wouldn't leave him alone. He knew he was taking a risk by going back, but something compelled him to act. Nate turned the car around and headed back toward the forest. He kept the headlights off, hoping to stay unnoticed. Every sound seemed suspicious, every step threatening. When he reached the spot where they had parted ways, the signs of a struggle were clear. Broken branches and footprints on the ground indicated that Alice had been there but had been taken. Nate grabbed a flashlight and started moving forward, his heart heavy with worry. Alice sat on the floor of the old shed, her hands tied, as a man in dark clothing stood before her. "Did you really think you could outsmart us?" he said, stepping closer. "You don't stand a chance," she replied, trying to sound confident. "You have no idea what Nate is doing right now." The man laughed, but his laughter was cut short as the shed door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Nate, his face tense and a crowbar in his hands. "Let her go," he said, stepping forward. The man turned to him and smirked. "You really think you can stop us?" Nate didn't reply. He quickly lunged forward, knocking the weapon out of one man's hands. A struggle ensued. Alice seized the opportunity and grabbed the wooden plank nearby. She struck her captor over the head, and he collapsed. "Quick, let's go," she shouted, trying to free her hands. Nate helped her to her feet, and they ran out of the shed together. Gunshots rang out behind them, but they managed to disappear into the trees in the darkness. Their footsteps were loud, but they didn't stop. "You shouldn't have come back," Alice said, gasping for breath. "I couldn't leave you," Nate replied. "We're still in this together." They made their way through the dense forest until they reached a small cabin. Inside, it was dark, but they shut the door and began to inspect the place. Nate found an old first aid kit and helped Alice treat her scratches. "What now?" she asked, looking at him. "We have to find a way to bring them down," he said. "We have the journal. The journalist will publish it. We just need to wait for the right moment." Alice paused for a moment, thinking, "Do you trust this journalist?" "I don't have a choice," Nate replied. They spent the night in the cabin, listening to every sound outside. Their situation was dangerous, but they knew they had to act carefully. At dawn, Nate decided to return to the city to check if the journal had been published. "Stay here," he told Alice. "I'll come back as soon as I know something." "Be careful," she replied, her voice filled with worry. Nate stepped out of the cabin and disappeared into the morning mist, leaving Alice alone. The morning was foggy and quiet. Alice sat in the small cabin, listening to the rustling leaves outside the window. She knew danger was near but tried to remain calm. Her thoughts kept returning to Nate, who had promised to return, but time dragged on unbearably slowly. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound resembling footsteps. Alice tensed, her heart pounding faster. She stood up and moved to the window, but she saw nothing. An inner voice told her to be cautious. The door suddenly swung open, and several men in dark clothing appeared on the threshold. Their expressions were grim, and their eyes fixed on her. "You made a mistake staying here," one of them said confidently. Alice didn't respond, her mind racing faster than ever. She realized her only chance was to escape. She dashed toward the nearest exit, trying to avoid confrontation. The men tried to catch her, but she managed to get out of the cabin and disappear into the forest. Meanwhile, far away, Nate suddenly felt something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but something urged him to go back. Turning the car around, he sped toward the cabin. His heart raced faster with each passing moment. When he arrived, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, there was chaos, but Alice was gone. Nate saw footprints leading into the forest. He followed them, hoping to find her. Alice pushed through the dense forest, trying to outrun her pursuers. Her breathing was heavy, but she didn't stop. Suddenly, She saw Nate ahead of her. Relief washed over her. "You came back," she exclaimed. "I couldn't leave you," Nate replied, helping her to her feet. Together, they continued moving, avoiding potential traps. Their journey was grueling, but they knew they had to find a safe place. When they finally reached an abandoned warehouse, Alice found a phone left behind by their attackers. She quickly scanned through the messages and realized the danger wasn't over yet. "We need to find the journalist," she said. "We still have a chance." "Do you trust him?" Nate asked. "We don't have another choice," Alice replied. They set off for the city, knowing their journey would be dangerous, but filled with hope that they could change everything. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Alice and Nate can overcome all obstacles and find a path to justice?